On the 9th of December 1873, in a darkened parlour in Hackney, a lawyer named William Volckman did something no one at that séance had ever dared to do before. When the white-robed figure of a spirit calling herself Katie King glided out from behind the cabinet curtain, Volckman did not simply watch, and he did not simply believe. He reached out, seized the spirit by the wrist and held on, for one suspended moment in a room lit only by candles and conviction. An entire community of believers had to confront the possibility that the ghost they had gathered to witness had a pulse, had warm skin, had the very solid and very human anatomy of a young woman trying desperately to twist free of a stranger's grip. Others in the room rushed to pull Volckman off. The figure broke away, vanished back behind the curtain. And minutes later, the medium herself, a teenage girl named Florence Cook, emerged from the cabinet exactly where a medium was supposed to be found, apparently drained, apparently innocent, apparently entirely separate from whatever Volckman had just held in his hand. He never let it go, not literally in that first frantic moment before the others pulled him away, and not afterward in his own mind. In the newspapers he wrote to in the days that followed, Volckman insisted in detail that what he had grabbed in the dark was not a ghost at all. But Florence Cook herself, dressed in muslin, playing a dead woman for a paying and grieving audience, tonight we revisit one case that split the scientific and spiritual establishment of an entire nation down the middle and never fully healed the divide. One teenage medium, one spirit she claimed to summon dozens of times before witnesses who included some of the most credentialed scientific minds in England, and one investigation so compromised by its own investigator that historians are still arguing, a century and a half later, about whether it was ever an investigation at all. The case of Florence Cook begins in Hackney, in East London, in the household of a lower middle-class family with no obvious connection to anything otherworldly at all. She was born around 1856 and grew up from the age of 3 in the modest household at Bruce Villas, opposite London Fields. Ordinary child in an ordinary London suburb, with nothing in her early years to suggest the peculiar fame that would find her before she was even out of her teens. Spiritualism, in the England of Florence Cook's childhood, was not a fringe curiosity. It was a genuine mass movement, drawing believers from every social class, promising grieving families a way to speak once more with husbands and children and parents lost to the era's relentless mortality. Seances were held in ordinary parlours across the country, and mediums, women in particular, found in the movement one of the very few paths available to them toward genuine public reputation and, in some cases, a genuine independent income. To understand how completely this movement had captured the Victorian imagination, you have to understand how much death an ordinary Victorian household actually absorbed. Infant mortality remained brutally high across the whole of the century. Diseases that medicine could neither prevent nor reliably treat, typhoid, diphtheria, tuberculosis, scarlet fever, moved through families with a regularity that meant almost no household of any class reached middle age without burying a child, a sibling, or a spouse well before their natural span. Mourning itself had become a highly formalized, highly visible ritual, black crepe, and prescribed periods of seclusion and elaborate funerary custom, a whole society that had built an entire public language for grief and yet possessed no institution, religious or medical, that could actually promise a grieving parent one more conversation with the child it had lost. Spiritualism arrived to fill precisely that gap. It cost the movement nothing to promise what the Church, for all its comfort, could never quite claim to deliver directly, and it cost a bereaved family everything they had to believe that the promise might, this time in this parlour, with this particular medium, actually be kept, given that appetite, a mass audience for materialization mediums, was practically guaranteed. Florence Cook did not need to convince a hostile or skeptical public. She needed only to give an already desperate public permission to believe what it already wanted to believe. Florence Cook began claiming mediumistic ability around 1870. As a teenager, still barely more than a child, holding her first séances in her own family home. It did not take long for the movement's own institutions to take notice. The secretary of the Dalston Association of Inquirers into Spiritualism, a man named Thomas Blyton, became sufficiently impressed by the young medium that he published an article about her in the movement's own journal, The Spiritualist, giving her, almost overnight, a credibility and a platform that an ordinary teenage girl from Hackney could never otherwise have hoped to obtain. She briefly held a position as an assistant at a private school in Richmond, ordinary working girl's job, and lost it by 1872, the demands and the growing fame of her séance career apparently already pulling her away from any more conventional path. I want you to sit with what it actually meant for a girl this young to be handed this particular kind of fame, because it explains a great deal about what came next. Florence Cook was not yet 20. She had no independent wealth, no powerful family, no education beyond the ordinary schooling available to a girl of her class. What she had, instead, was a talent, whether genuine or manufactured, for commanding a darkened room and an entire movement of grown adults, some of them among the most respected men in England, prepared to take that talent with total seriousness and reward it with the kind of attention a teenage girl from Hackney would otherwise never have received in her life. Between 1871 and 1872, Cook trained under two more established mediums, Frank Herne and Charles Williams. Herne specialized in channeling a spirit he called John King, and it was through this connection that Florence Cook was introduced to the figure who would define the whole of her public career, a spirit calling herself Katie King, presented as John King's daughter. Over the following months and years, Katie King evolved, in Cook's séances, from a disembodied voice and a dimly glimpsed face into something far more remarkable and far more commercially valuable. Fully materialized human figure, walking, speaking, and appearing to the naked eye as solid and as present as any living woman in the room. The mechanics that made such a materialization appear convincing depended almost entirely on control of the physical environment. And Cook, like every serious medium of her era, understood exactly how to arrange that control. The séance cabinet, typically a curtained alcove or a simply screened corner of the room, was where the medium sat, ostensibly bound or restrained, while the spirit was said to draw the physical substance it needed from the medium's own body in order to take form outside it. Light was kept low, usually a single red or dimmed lamp, on the stated grounds that bright light disrupted the delicate physical process of materialization, a claim that also, conveniently, made it extremely difficult for any sitter to make out fine detail, a face, a hairline, the particular cut of a garment, closely enough to compare the spirit against the medium with any real confidence. Sitters were seated in a fixed circle, often holding hands, a ritual meant to concentrate spiritual energy that also had the practical effect of keeping the audience physically anchored in place, unable to rise and investigate without visibly disrupting the whole solemn atmosphere the room had been built to sustain. Every element of a materialization seance, the darkness, the seating, the restraint, the ritual, served the spiritual explanation offered to the sitters and, whether by design or fortunate coincidence, the practical requirements of a physical deception as well. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now, back to the record. Think about what a full physical materialization actually promised the grieving families who paid to witness it. This was not a table rap or a whispered word from beyond a curtain, the kind of modest phenomena that most mediums of the era offered their sitters. This was, if genuine, proof beyond any reasonable argument that the dead did not simply speak to the living but could, under the right conditions, return to them bodily, could be seen and touched and spoken with as though death itself were no more than a temporary absence. Florence Cook was selling to a nation that had buried an extraordinary number of its own children and parents and spouses to disease in an age before modern medicine, the single most valuable promise imaginable, that loss was not permanent, and that she, personally, held the key to proving it. The Volckman incident on the 9th of December 1873 should by rights have ended Florence Cook's career on the spot. A grown man had physically seized the materialized spirit and insisted, in the clearest possible terms, that what he held was Cook herself. Volckman published his account and his conviction widely, and the incident became one of the most talked about controversies the spiritualist movement had yet produced. But it did not end her career. Defenders argued that Volckman had violated the basic etiquette of a proper séance, that his sudden physical intervention had been reckless and improper, regardless of what it may or may not have proven, and some pointed to a personal rivalry, suggesting Volckman had connections to a competing medium, Mrs. Guppy, and had acted from professional jealousy rather than disinterested scientific concern. The controversy, rather than closing the case against her, simply hardened both sides of an argument that had, already by 1873, become close to a matter of religious faith for many of its participants. Because what happened next is the part of this story that has troubled serious historians for a century and a half, because it involves not an amateur enthusiast, but one of the most credentialed scientific minds in Victorian England, and the question of whether his science was ever actually science at all. Sir William Crookes was a chemist and physicist of genuine and lasting reputation, a man whose work in other fields would be remembered long after spiritualism itself had faded from public life. Cook, facing renewed scrutiny after the Volckman affair, approached Crooks directly and asked him to investigate her and, in effect, to clear her name. If this account is holding you the way it holds me, stay with it, because what happened inside Crooks's own home over the following months is one of the strangest scientific episodes of the entire 19th century. Crooks agreed, but on his own terms, insisting the investigation take place at his own house before an audience of his own choosing, under conditions he alone controlled. A 15-year-old Florence Cook, by this point, was brought into Crookes' household and, according to his own published account, materialized the full figure of Katie King repeatedly in front of his family and his chosen witnesses. The spirit, in Crookes' telling, walked freely about the room, spoke at length, submitted to being measured and weighed, and at one point even held the infant child of a member of the household. Crookes published his findings in 1874, endorsing Cook's genuineness alongside two of the era's other most famous mediums, Kate Fox and Daniel Douglas Home, lending her the full and considerable weight of his own scientific reputation. Understand what that endorsement actually did for Florence Cook's career, because it was worth more to her than any single séance fee could ever have been. William Crookes was a Fellow of the Royal Society, a man whose experimental rigor in the study of gases and rare elements was already respected across the scientific establishments of Europe. For a man of that stature to attach his name to a teenage medium's claims did not merely defend her against the Volckman scandal, it transformed her almost overnight. from a locally known Hackney medium facing accusations of trickery into a figure whose abilities had supposedly withstood the most exacting scientific examination available in the whole of England. Believers who might otherwise have quietly dropped away after the Volckman incident now had a genuine scientific authority to point to. Skeptics found themselves forced to argue not simply against a teenage girl in a darkened parlour, but against the reputation of one of the era's most credentialed men of science. Crooks did not just vouch for Florence Cook. He rebuilt almost single-handedly the entire foundation her career had nearly lost. Here is the trouble that has never gone away. The conditions of Crooks' investigation were, by any modern scientific standard, hopelessly compromised. He alone chose the witnesses. He alone controlled the setting. He alone determined what counted as sufficient proof. A teenage girl was, by his own arrangement, alone in his home for extended periods, and the growing body of historical scholarship on this case has pointed, with real evidentiary weight, toward a far more troubling explanation for his unwavering support than pure scientific conviction. Historian Courtney Ryer and others have argued that Crooks's relationship with Cook had crossed into a romantic and physical affair, and that his celebrated scientific endorsement of her mediumship functioned, whether he fully admitted it to himself or not, as a convenient public cover for a private relationship an eminent married scientist could never otherwise have sustained. Science historian Sherry Lynn Lyons, reviewing the full body of evidence decades later, concluded plainly that Katie King was, in the end, simply Florence Cook herself, sometimes assisted by an accomplice, and that Crooks, whatever his brilliance in the laboratory, proved entirely unable to detect a living young woman, disguised as a ghost standing directly in front of him. Consider the layers of deception actually operating in that room. Florence Cook was, by the most credible modern reading, deceiving her sitters about the existence of a ghost, and Crooks may, at the very same time, have been complicit in an entirely different deception, using the language of rigorous science to disguise a personal entanglement that would have destroyed both of their reputations had it been stated plainly. The fraud and the cover for the fraud may have been operating on two separate tracks simultaneously, each one protecting the other, and it took the passage of well over a century for historians to begin properly untangling which was which. Cook's career did not end with the Crooks investigation, and neither did the pattern of controversy that had followed her from the very beginning. In March of 1874, Katie King made a joint appearance alongside a spirit called Florence Maple, materialized by another young medium named Mary Showers, who was exposed as fraudulent shortly afterward, drawing Cook's own reputation deeper into the same widening cloud of suspicion that had begun engulfing the entire physical materialization branch of the spiritualist movement. Years later, in 1880, a witness named George Sitwell interrupted one of her séances and, in a scene that directly echoed the Volckman incident of 7 years before, seized the materialized spirit figure only to find, once again, that Florence Cook herself was absent from the chair where the medium was supposed to be sitting throughout. Twice, in 2 separate decades, under 2 separate sets of witnesses, the identical accusation surfaced in the identical way. A stranger reached out in the dark, and the ghost turned out to have Florence Cook's own absence built directly into its choreography. And yet neither exposure, not Volckman's grip in 1873 nor Sitwell's in 1880, ever produced a decisive, final reckoning that settled the matter for the wider public. Each time, the movement's own defenders found a reason to discount the witness, a personal grudge, a failure of proper séance etiquette, an unreliable account exaggerated after the fact, Each time a portion of the believing public simply chose the version of events that let them keep believing. This is, in its own way, the most durable lesson the case of Florence Cook has to offer anyone studying the mechanics of a long-running deception. It rarely requires a con artist to survive every single exposure unscathed. It requires only that enough of the audience, when finally confronted with the evidence of the trick, prefer the comfort of the old story to the discomfort of the new one, and will supply, unprompted, whatever reasoning is needed to keep believing what they had already decided to believe, long before the lights ever came up. Cook married a man named Edward Elgie Corner, the son of a board member of the very Dalston Association that had first championed her career, and the marriage produced 3 children, though Cook filed for divorce within the first year, citing domestic violence, in proceedings that appear never to have been fully finalized. She continued to work as a medium in the years that followed, her public fame diminished but never entirely extinguished, till her death in Battersea on the 22nd of April, 1904. What does this case reveal about the world that made it possible? It reveals how completely genuine grief could override even the most rigorous instruments of scientific scrutiny available to an era. William Crookes was not a credulous fool. He was one of the sharpest experimental minds of his generation, a man whose reputation in chemistry and physics has endured to this day. And yet, faced with a teenage girl and a darkened room, he produced an investigation so compromised by its own design and quite possibly by his own private feelings that it told the public far more about the limits of even genuine expertise than it ever told them about the reality of the spirit world. There is a second, harder observation worth sitting with here about who actually bore the risk in this entire arrangement. Florence Cook was a working-class girl in her mid to late teens, entirely dependent on the continued belief of powerful men for her livelihood and her reputation. Whatever agency she exercised, whatever calculation went into her performances, she was also, undeniably, operating within a system where a single influential man's endorsement or withdrawal of support could make or break her entire life. The scandal, when it eventually caught up with the wider physical materialization movement, fell hardest on the young women performing the seances rather than on the credentialed men who had built entire reputations on vouching for them. Crooks went on to a distinguished career, eventually knighted, remembered by history chiefly for his legitimate scientific work. Cook has come down to us largely as a punchline, the fraud who fooled a great scientist, when the fuller and stranger truth is that the scientist may have had his own private reasons for wanting, quite badly to be fooled. Weigh the asymmetry of that arrangement carefully. A girl not yet 20, with no independent means and no institution behind her beyond a small local spiritualist association, entered into an investigation designed, staffed, and adjudicated entirely by one of the most powerful men she would ever encounter, a man roughly twice her age, with a wife, a public reputation, and every social advantage available to a Victorian gentleman of science. If the affair historians describe did take place, it occurred inside a relationship so lopsided in power that the word affair itself risks flattering an arrangement that gave Florence Cook remarkably little genuine choice in how it was conducted or how it would later be remembered. Whichever judgment history eventually renders on her honesty as a medium, it is worth asking what alternative a girl in her precise position, famous, financially dependent on that fame, entirely reliant on the goodwill of exactly the kind of man conducting her investigation, would realistically have had. Think, too, about the sheer number of people this single case of alleged deception ultimately touched, because a materialization seance was never a private performance for an audience of one. Cook's sittings drew circles of family friends, fellow spiritualists, curious skeptics, and the grieving, all gathered in good faith around a single darkened room. Every one of them carried away either a strengthened belief that the dead could return, or a private and unresolved unease about what they had actually witnessed. Multiply that across the hundreds of seances Cook is believed to have held over the course of her career, and the true scale of this case comes into sharper focus. It was never simply about whether one teenage girl fooled one eminent scientist. It was about how many grieving households built genuine comfort and, in some cases, genuine life decisions on the strength of an illusion staged in a rented parlour by candlelight. Here is the question I want to leave you with, and I would genuinely like to read what you make of it in the comments below. If William Crookes' endorsement of Florence Cook was compromised from the very start by a private relationship he never publicly admitted to, does that make him a co-conspirator in the fraud, victim of his own infatuation, or something more uncomfortable still, a man who understood perfectly well what was happening in that darkened parlour and simply preferred the version of events that let both of them keep what they wanted? I am not certain the historical record will ever answer that question completely, and I think that uncertainty is in its own way the most honest place this case can leave us. The house at Bruce Villas in Hackney is long gone, absorbed decades ago into the ordinary residential streets of a city that has moved on from its Victorian fascination with the spirit world. Sir William Crookes' scientific legacy survives in encyclopedias and physics textbooks that make no mention at all of the darkened seance rooms where his judgment, by his own published account, was never once shaken, an omission that says a great deal about which parts of a distinguished man's life history chooses to remember and which parts it quietly sets aside. The record of Florence Cook survives in the argument itself, in the Volckman incident and the Sitwell incident and the Crooks investigation sitting side by side. Each one a piece of evidence pointing the same direction, and each one, somehow, never quite enough to fully close the case in the minds of everyone who has studied it since. That is, in its own way, the most remarkable single fact about this whole case. It is not that the evidence against Florence Cook is thin. Two separate strangers, 7 years apart, physically laid hands on the same alleged spirit and found the same absent medium. It is that the evidence has never once, in a century and a half of study, proven sufficient to fully settle the argument for everyone who has looked at it, because the argument was never really about evidence at all. It was about which story a given reader, a given historian, a given sitter in a given darkened parlour needed to be true. Her full name, when the record bothers to give it in full, was Florence Eliza Cook, a working-class girl from Hackney who became, before she was out of her teens, one of the most famous and most contested mediums in the history of British spiritualism, endorsed by a genuine scientific luminary under conditions that may have had far more to do with his heart than his instruments, and unmasked twice by strangers who simply reached out into the dark and found a living woman where a ghost was supposed to be standing. She married, raised 3 children, continued working seances quietly for the remaining decades of her life, never again reaching the extraordinary heights of fame that a single credulous scientist had briefly handed her in her mid-teens, and never fully escaping the suspicion that had first attached itself to her name in a Hackney parlour before she was even old enough to be considered fully an adult. Katie King never existed anywhere but in a candlelit parlour and the willingness of an entire grieving nation, still counting its own dead by the 1,000 every year, to believe that death could be undone for the price of a seance ticket. somewhere between the hand that grabbed a wrist in 1873 and the hand that grabbed an empty chair in 1880, is the whole shape of what Florence Cook actually sold, and it was never, for a single evening, a spirit. It was, instead, the far rarer and far more marketable thing a bereaved century could not manufacture for itself, permission to believe that the darkness had given something back.